Paul Anleitner, Paul VanderKlay and John Vervaeke met online to have a very fascinating and indeed beautiful discussion about what God means. The two Pauls speaking from positions of faith, committed faith, and John Vervaeke speaking from the position of the open, questing agnostic. And in a very John Vervaeke move, he invited the Pauls to speak about God without using the word God because of all the confusion that that can bring, and instead addressing what he called the 4 L's of light, of love, of logos, and of life. 4 L's often associated with the nature of the divine in various traditions. And it set me thinking about Dante and what he might bring to this discussion, since in the Divine Comedy it struck me that these 4 L's very much weave together to lead to Dante's dramatically expanded perception of reality. And so wanted to offer a few thoughts to weave into that conversation. If you listened, if you hadn't, maybe even if the Pauls or John were listening in too, having myself spoken to Paul VanderKlay and John Vervaeke in the past. So let me start with the first of the L's as I've taken them, which is the notion of light. Now, light clearly matters because it has an inner as well as an outer meaning, the meaning of illumination. You turn on the lights to see and you feel enlightened inside when you've understood something. And it's very fascinating how the word light applies both to the inner and the outer. I had some sense of that crossover from what you might call the physical to the mental world when a while back I interviewed Roger Penrose, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, who is also very interesting because he's a self-avowed Platonist in terms of the way he understands physics, and so feels that the academic discipline of physics is an external way of engaging with the inner nature of reality. That's partly what being a Platonist means to him. And when we were just getting ready to talk, he turned the lights on in his study, and because it was the evening, the light went up in his study, and he muttered almost as an afterthought, bathed in eternity. And it was a rather wonderful moment for me to hear him say that. But what in a way he was doing was reflecting on the nature of light and how photons, according to the physics, don't experience space and time, but also using that to clearly invoke a felt sense of the nature of light as well, and that there was something timeless even in the timed moment of our gathering. We were going to speak about timeless things, you might say. And so this link between the material nature of light and the spiritual came to mind. And I think what, in a way, Penrose realises, but certainly let me say what Dante realised, is that the material world, which can be studied externally, is always an echo or a reflection of the interior world, the spiritual reality. And certainly when light is talked about in spiritual traditions, that's the way it's meant, that physical reality can be seen to express or make manifest aspects of spiritual reality, which is why it's said, spiritual reality is said therefore to be truer, to be more real. You get this, I think, in astrological traditions, which is something you have to grapple with if you read the Divine Comedy, because the planetary spheres are said to be the 7 heavens into which Dante travels in the paradise. And I think the way that Dante understands it is not through some pseudo-physical sense of the nature of the inflow or the influx, the influence, originally an astrological term, of the planetary physical presences, but rather that the planets can be experienced as sharing, or at least manifesting to the human mind, various aspects of divine light. of spiritual reality. So the sun, just to take one obvious example, is the most obvious physical light in the sky for us, indeed the source of all our light. And so it speaks of the glory of God most manifestly. And so even if you don't believe in God, to be in the sun is very often, maybe nearly always, to feel uplifted. And people miss the sun during the winter months when it doesn't appear, particularly in the higher parts of the northern hemisphere. So physical light speaks to us and warms us and draws us because it's actually speaking to us and drawing us towards spiritual realities. I think that this is actually the case very often the way people talk about physics. Sometimes people get this the wrong way round when, for example, they might talk about quantum spirituality as if somehow physics, and quantum physics in particular, is somehow proving spiritual verities to us. I think that's not what happened actually in history, that the great founders of quantum physics, people like Heisenberg, people like Dirac, they turned to spiritual traditions to try to interpret what they were beginning to see physically. The physics of quantum physics is not complete, it's not fully understood, particularly when it comes to its ontological significance, which is why there's debate about things like the Copenhagen interpretation and so on. But what these great physicists did, and I think what Roger Penrose does in turning to the Platonic tradition too, is precisely the right way round of considering spiritual reality as illuminating physical manifestations of reality. It reaches back to an older perception that the subjective is actually more real than the objective. This was taken to be the case in epistemology since Aristotle, right into the medieval period. Dante certainly would have still agreed with that, although there was debate about it in Dante's time. And it's the sense that if you can be in touch with the inner nature of things, you know this for yourself, but for wider reality as well, you touch that which is more stable, less changeable, closer to the bedrock or the ground of what you are studying. And the objective, that which can be measured, that which is quantitative, that which is more amenable to your power, to your manipulation, is that which changes about the nature of things. I mean, put it like this, it's why science itself constantly changes, whereas spiritual traditions last for millennia. They're in touch with the inner nature, which is less changeable. And so thinking about light in that way, from, you might say, the inside out rather than the outside in, I think is important in spiritual traditions. But Dante takes it a step further because he also realizes that it's not just the bright lights of enlightenment, the peak experience, like the bright sunshine, that actually really takes you into the nature of things. It's the subtle light that counts as much as well. It can be both more enlightening and more dangerous. So Dante really starts to get a sense of this in the Divine Comedy when he enters the sphere of the sun, the brightest light. And you might think, well, to enter the heavenly sun would be the culmination of his journey. But it's not actually. He's barely a third of the way into the paradise. But it is a pivot point, because what he realizes there is that what seems brightest and most manifest and most obvious is only a stepping stone, an invitation to consider things which are at first much more confusing, much more subtle, much more nuanced, but actually turn out to be far more significant for the spiritual journey. He sees this because he encounters figures who disagreed on Earth. This is one of the brilliant things about Dante, is there's always a story that helps illuminate the point. And figures like Thomas Aquinas and Sigar of Brabant in particular, a figure not known now, but he was a great Averroist scholar in the medieval period. And Aquinas and Sigar disagreed to the point of Thomas declaring Sigar a heretic at the time. But now, in the heaven of the sun, what they realise is that the things that they spoke about so powerfully and so well with such illumination and light in life were merely expressions of a subtler, deeper light that were as much flawed and mistaken as they were true and illuminating. And so when in their mortal lives they focused on what they felt to be true, and so therefore declared each other heretics, in their immortal lives they realized that the passion, the inner convictions that drove their public pronouncements is actually more important, because they draw from their perceptions of the true light, the source of all their pronunciations, which is God. So that's what Dante learns in the heaven of the sun, that the subtler light actually counts more. And then this continues when he moves into the next heaven of Mars. Mars, of course, being a subtler light in the sky. And what he realizes there is that there's this important move of self-sacrifice, giving up what you take to be your clearly discerned light, your strongest convictions, as much as sacrificing your sense of yourself into a wider sense of life. That becomes more and more important to move closer and closer to divine convictions. Mars is the light associated with the sacrifice of war, a very crude, blunt, manifest notion of sacrifice. And what Dante learns the spiritual light of Mars teaching him is that letting go of his strongest convictions, but not letting go of the energy that led him to those strongest convictions, is important for seeing more of the divine light, which is also to say why sacrifice, the theme of letting go, is so powerful in spiritual traditions. Letting go paradoxically leads to more light. This continues when Dante moves into the next heaven, the heaven of Jupiter. He asks the eagle of Jupiter who appears to him there about how it can be that those who haven't heard about Christ can be in heaven, which is something he's increasingly seen. It's the subtler understanding of paradise that he's being invited to contemplate in the sphere of Jupiter. He's met all sorts of people who he didn't at all think might know about the nature of the divine, and so be able to share in the life of the divine in the paradisal state. What's wonderful about this is that when the eagle of justice in Jupiter explains to Dante that much subtler criteria count when it comes to people being able to appreciate, withstand, absorb the divine light, and so be able to share in the paradisal state. Dante is at once happy about that, because he's felt the injustice of the kind of only Christians go to heaven position, but he's also stumped, and the eagle of Jupiter flies around him, delighted to have confused Dante all the more, because what the eagle's saying, and then this becomes even clearer in the heaven of Saturn, which they move to next, is not that it's some kind of blanket everyone goes to heaven that God issues, but precisely what's required is a deeper understanding of what it takes to share in the divine life that is being opened up to Dante. And so this subtler light is becoming the light that leads him to the source of all light and to the divine. So the point there is that when it comes to talking about God as light, this is not just a blast of truth where suddenly everything becomes clear and you can say, I get it at last. It's often quite the opposite, that it's the grappling with the subtleties that open up truer verities that you know partly within yourself, partly as you look at life and consider the nature of these things more generally. That is what makes it significant to talk about God being light. The subtle lights count. Let me move to thinking about love, because there's a parallel kind of consideration here. The move would be that much as enlightenment isn't just about a blast of light, a kind of peak experience. So I think the real significance of love is not that it's about a statement that all you need is love, as if that can carry you all the way. It may well be that an experience of love opens you up to how love and truth are connected, the very common experience of falling in love. But that happened to Dante when, as a youth, he fell in love with Beatrice, and it barely was even the beginning of his journey, and he has to learn an awful lot more about love to find his way through the Divine Comedy. Roughly, you might say that the significance of love is that it's a go-between God, as Plato puts it, that it draws you towards that which is good, beautiful, and true, and enables you more and more to befriend that which is good, beautiful, and true, but also calls forth from you that which enables you to become a better friend of the good, the beautiful, and the true. Love has this amazing capacity, really, that it doesn't just reveal the nature of reality to us, but gives us the energy to change in order to be able to resonate with reality more and more fully. And that's really important, because this is about the kind of knowledge that is participative, that's about becoming more open and expansive, resonating more and more, harmonizing more and more with reality. It's why love is a virtue, that the virtues are those qualities of our personality and character that don't just mean we can be called a good person in the rather narrow moral sense, but rather open us up to resonate more and more with reality in undefended ways, in courageous ways, in ways that enable us to embrace the sacrifice that's necessary, and so become expansive. And that's really their draw. That's what's so wonderful about the virtues, and love in particular. They have epistemological benefits and help us to appreciate the nature of reality more and more. You get this in dialogue, for example, where you have to be open, undefended, humble, capable of listening in order to grow, and not just be forceful in terms of putting your own position across. You might say that love can know it all, but not necessarily know about it all. Love is the sense of the wider, potentially infinite presence that's drawing us. But that's not to say that therefore we can know all about it in terms of being able to articulate what the nature of that presence is. So in spiritual traditions, love is also very closely associated with the cloud of unknowing, with the apophatic. And I think it's in that sense that God is love is meant, that this experience of the divine is known most fully, but perhaps most also silently, by the experience of the love within us that draws us to the divine. And of course, in the nature of divine things, that which draws us is also the experience of God too, as well as drawing us towards the experience of God. But this mediating quality of love has other effects which are important, and Dante learns about. In particular, it's part of the difficulty of the divine journey. And when Dante finally meets Beatrice at the pinnacle of Mount Purgatory in the heavenly Eden, you might think it would be a lovely romantic reunion of Dante and his youthful beloved, but actually Beatrice chastises Dante ferociously for a couple of cantos. It's really quite a painful read. And what this is relating to is another very common feature of spiritual traditions, which is that love can seem to be very harsh. It can seem to lead to a sense of abandonment. Beatrice seems to Dante to be mercilessly treating him at their meeting. And, for example, in the Sufi tradition, Shams is said to have abandoned Rumi. It's about, I think, refining the object of love that people long for, and actually having to let go of the sense that any object can satisfy your love, because again, this love searches for the ground of its own being. It searches for that which is known already, otherwise love itself wouldn't be possible already. It's why William Blake talks about wars of love. The difficult passage of love that opens onto all things is undergone. So this is also to say that it transforms the nature of suffering. Socrates had commented on this, according to Plato, in the Symposium, one of the great dialogues on love, when at the end Socrates wondered whether it was ever possible to write a tragedy that was also a comedy, whether these two aspects of life, the suffering and the delightful, could go together. And the question that Socrates raised is answered in a way by the traditions that unfold in the Platonic time, of which Christianity is one, that which is delightful ultimately can be seen to embrace that which is tragic, not because it writes off that which is tragic, but precisely because it's through the experience of loss, even the experience of death, that the reliability, the resilience, the constancy of love to hold all things in life is known. It's another manifestation of the letting go that lets in all things, and is the opposite, incidentally, of what Dante found in hell, where people live off their projections of God. They make idols, they make the divine into an object that they think they understand. Often in hell, they think that they fear. And so it's only when Dante has seen that directly and realised that there's deep mistakes that keep people trapped in these hellish perceptions that enables him to move to more paradisal perceptions and follow the line of love that leads to the divine more carefully, more subtly, more truly. So that's to say something about love. It's the way that it draws us more deeply into reality rather than floods us with good feeling that counts. A similar dynamic is at play when it comes to considering the Logos, the third of the three L's. Take the less well-known comment of Heraclitus on the Logos. He said words to the effect of, those who listen to the Logos perceive that all things are one. And this comment of his needs to be set alongside the much more known comments about the nature of reality being flux, like that you can't step into the same river twice. I think it's really important to hold the two comments of Heraclitus together, because in a way the flux comment, the much better well-known one, is the perhaps more immediate perception of the nature of reality, which you see even physically with your eyes when you consider that the river is flowing and so you can't step into the same river twice. But what Heraclitus also realises that by listening rather than by seeing, remember listening is the more open, expansive of the spiritual senses. It requires you to open the gates of your perception, to sacrifice something of your own control in terms of receiving truth, unlike sight, which is much more about looking onto, grabbing, possessing. And so by listening to the Logos, Heraclitus realised a deeper perception of things comes to be known, which is that all things are one. Now this is a very interesting understanding of the Logos in terms of its subsequent development, particularly through Stoicism and into Christianity, because I think one of the things that it launches, which again is often missed these days, is a fuller realization of the monotheistic perception of reality. In the pre-Socratics, this isn't completely formed, much as it's not completely formed for much of the Hebrew Bible. Figures like Plato, with their sense that the good, the beautiful and the true come together into one, are an important step that then is fully expressed in figures like Plotinus with the notion of the one. But what this is doing in terms of the development of the perception of the Logos is that fostering the sense is not just that the Logos is a kind of principle in the cosmos which the Stoic sage or the Platonic adept can kind of tap into and make some sense of, but is the sense that all of reality, all of creation, to use the more Hebrew word, are part of this divine reality, are already within the Logos. And so, for example, when Paul speaks to the Athenians, if the Acts of the Apostles are at all accurate as a historical document, it's when he quotes the Stoic remarks that, for example, God is that within which we live and move and have our being, or that we are all citizens of the cosmos, meant in the spiritual sense that we have our belonging in the cosmic divine reality. When Paul puts those comments to the Stoic philosophers he speaks to, they understand that Paul and them have got something in common and they need to speak further. Whereas it's the Epicurean sages who have also assembled to listen to Paul that don't get what Paul is talking about and so want no more to do with him. I think the Stoics realise that this new dispensation is actually a culmination of perceptions that were emerging within their own tradition. And so they become interested in listening to the Christian take on things, and even the possibility that the Logos, which holds all things, was known so powerfully and directly in the figure of Jesus, this one historical person who actually lived and died, that they see it's a development of their own tradition. You might say they understand more and more fully as monotheism develops that the gods aren't apart from us and separate, the perception that the Epicureans felt so keenly, but actually the divine, the one that holds all things, within which all things live and move and have their being, is that which is paradoxically most immanent within us. It is closer to us than we are to ourselves, to use Augustine's phrase, and is that which is most transcendent because it embraces and holds all things too. I sometimes wonder whether this is a truth that we get intimations of in everyday life. So, for example, the parent to the child is the good parent to the child, is the one who can both know through empathy enough of the inner life of the child to be right alongside the child, and even to give the child the sense that the parent is there with them in the innermost parts of their being. But of course, to be really useful to the child, the parent must also be able to perceive aspects of life which are much bigger and wider than the child is capable of because of its developmental stage. And so in a way, the parent is at once immanent to the child and transcendent of the child. Parental imagery is often used in relation to the divine, I think, for similar reasons. And this sense of the immanence and the transcendence of the Logos shows up in another way, back to the apophatic perception of the divine as well, because the Logos, in terms of the words which are actually spoken, must be able to bring in what Margaret Masterman, the philosopher, called the edge of words, so that the spoken words, the manifest words, the physical word, is at once communicating more than just what it can capture, and so speaking to the divine Logos from which it comes. You might say that this is the kenotic nature of words. The word is spoken, but then must give up its claim to understand and embrace the truth fully, in order that the wider truth that it pointed through, that it might guide towards, that it might evoke in the hearer, can be felt. Dante knows this completely. The higher and further, more deeply he gets into reality in the paradise, the more he starts talking about how his words must stop, and yet he must keep speaking for as long as he can in order to keep steering this path through the nature of all things. And right at the end of the paradise, in Canto 33 of the Paradiso, just before the complete beatific vision, when he knows of his complete oneness with all things, he talks about Neptune, the god who looked up from the depths of the Black Sea when the Argonauts sailed the first ship, the Argos, across the surface of the sea. And Neptune, because this was the first ship, this new manifestation of a consciousness that led to the technology, didn't know what he was looking at, couldn't express it, and so take it in. And Dante says that Neptune spent many centuries contemplating what had been seen in order to try and make some sense of it. And Dante says this is the experience that he's at now as his words fall into a final silence in order to embrace the divine. It's that moment of letting go that lets in to use that expression once more, that's really important when it comes to words too, the edge of words, the gap around the words, what can be heard within the words. The very common experience of poetry, of course, it's the energy that the words communicate as much as what they communicate explicitly that counts. The two things must come together in order to point to the divine Logos, known, at least in the Christian tradition, as the Logos being part of the divine, the second person of the Trinity, in another part of this complex of the figure of Jesus and the perception that he had been so transparent to the divine that could be said to be the full incarnation of the divine, and so the type for us all. So this takes us to the fourth L, that of life, and it gathers together a number of the threads that have been weaving through consideration of love, of Logos, and of light, which is the asymmetric nature of reality. Put it like this, by drawing on a bit of physics, that cold is not actually anything in itself. Cold is rather the absence of heat, and heat is the real thing because it's the energy, and the more energy a substance can be said to have, the more heat it has, and then conversely, of course, the less energy it has, the colder it has. But cold is the absence of heat. And so you get the same reality perceived in many spiritual traditions when, for example, it's realised that reason, say, depends upon something else. Perhaps inspiration, perhaps imagination, and perhaps intuition, that reason then can work on in order to try and articulate and discern. But that's the relationship, it's the master-emissary relationship. Reason is the emissary to the master, which is the source of all intelligibility. The same thing occurs in the famous discussions about the nature of good and evil, and how in the spiritual traditions very often evil is said to be the absence of that which is good. And so a figure like Socrates can say that the bad is actually a form of ignorance, not understanding the good, the beautiful and the true, which draws us towards itself, making mistakes about that. This difficult teaching, because evil can clearly show up, manifest in the world as a real thing, but the spiritual reality behind that is that is a sham of reality. Evil is a failure to understand the nature of things, and that in the spiritual perception it can be known that there's this asymmetric relationship and that the good is what is true. Similarly with life and death, you might say that death is the absence of life in the way that life isn't the absence of death. And so the comedic can hold the tragic, life can hold death, light can hold the darkness. These asymmetries show up constantly in spiritual traditions. I think this is the significance of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates actually dies. And the reason why Plato has an account of that is not because he's hoping to write for history how Socrates actually died. It's clearly an artful presentation of Socrates' death, in which Socrates invites his friends and his disciples to follow him right to the point of death and to feel the ferocity, the fear of that moment, in order that they can know that life exceeds it. It's only by embracing death that you can know that life embraces you. And again, this is a deep truth within spiritual traditions, once more, I think, shown in the Christian tradition with Christ on the cross, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Perhaps the hardest thing for we human beings, we mortals, is to know that the way to life is the way through death. That's not about going around trying to shirk death in any kind of way. It's through death that more and more life is known, with all that moving through death means, of course. This is also to say that, we're saved by the allure of life. That is what keeps drawing us. The allure of light and the allure of Logos and the allure of love as well. And this is why Beatrice explains to Dante, again in the latter stages of the Paradise, that the Christian understanding of the cross as somehow a sacrifice that appeases divine reality or pays the price of sin or as a ransom to Satan, that's actually a lesser understanding of what Dante can know now, which is that evil, sin, the bad, is a digression. It's sort of a waste of time, Beatrice tells Dante at this latter stage, because what is truer in the Christian story he's learned is the incarnation. That is the fundamental act and movement of the divine in relation to reality. It's by being born within the reality that at the same time is made that the divine is known. Life is bigger than death and can embrace death. This understanding that the incarnation matters more than the cross is known in Orthodox circles, which draw very much more directly upon Platonic traditions, and the thing that can be so hard for Western Christians. So, for example, if you go into an Orthodox church, you will see an image of the incarnation, of Mary holding the Christ in her womb, much more quickly than you will see a cross. You might have to go to the back of the church to find a cross. Beatrice is saying this to Dante, and I think draws us more into the understanding of the Trinity as well. It's what you might call the hypostatic nature of reality, hypostasis being the Greek word for person. Worth using the Greek because this is about trying to get over the reduction of the Trinity to three persons that somehow get on very well in heavenly life, and rather say that actually our personhood is precisely this self-giving, this kenotic, this drawing and constantly renewing, energizing, enlivening experience of life, which we consciously, self-consciously have as persons. And again, I think there are parallels of this in other spiritual traditions, in the Vedantic tradition, particularly Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual tradition. This is the understanding that the ignorance about reality is not that reality itself is some kind of mirage, but that we can be so easily mistaken about the nature of reality that it is the lila, the dance of the one reality. And then in Islam you have a different expression of it when it's talked about the many names of the divine, and that the brilliant thing about being human is that an understanding of all the names of the divine can be grasped. And so that's a key part of what enables human beings to experience the life of God. So that's something about the four L's, and as you might expect, when the monotheistic perception is so strong, they all in their different ways lead towards a sense of God. Light, love, logos, life. It's the subtler meanings of these four things that actually carry the more nuanced, deeper perception of reality, partly because we're talking about that which is known from the inside out rather than the outside in, but also because it's asking us to change always, and in that change we become more resonant, and so wake up more and more to that which is always the underpinning of our experience of light, of love, of logos, and of life.